They say the swamps of Louisiana don't just hold water, they hold secrets. And if you listen closely to the wind through the cypress knees, you might still hear the ghost of a scream that history tried to drown in the mud. Imagine a world where your skin is a cage, where every breath you draw is owned by a man who views you as less than the cattle in his field. Now, imagine that same man, handing you a whip, handing you an axe, handing you the power to snap the neck of the very world that broke you. This isn't just a story of survival. This is the chilling, blood-stained chronicle of Louis Congo, the enslaved man who didn't just break his chains, he turned them into a noose for 89 of the cruelest men the South had ever seen. Welcome to the shadows of history. Pull a chair close to the fire. You won't want to miss a single heartbeat of this. The decision of the French Superior Council to appoint Louis Congo as the official executioner of Louisiana was a gamble born of pure desperation and deep-seated racial arrogance. In the fledgling colony of the 1700s, the role of the bourreau, or executioner, was considered a spiritual and social death sentence for any white Frenchman. The elite officials found themselves in a crisis where they had laws to enforce, but no one willing to swing the axe or tighten the noose without being cast out of polite society. They looked upon the enslaved population not as humans with internal lives, but as convenient tools that were already socially dead in the eyes of the law. By choosing Louis, they believed they were simply assigning a grim task to a man who had nothing left to lose in their hierarchy. This deal was struck in the humid halls of New Orleans, where parchment and ink were used to bridge a gap between colonial necessity and moral cowardice. Little did the council realize that by handing over the Black Hood, they were relinquishing the very monopoly on violence that kept their fragile society afloat. The terms of the agreement were unprecedented and carried the scent of a miracle to any man living under the crushing weight of permanent bondage. Louis was promised his full manumission, a small but significant salary, and even a modest plot of land located on the outskirts of the primary settlement. To the French, this was a logical trade. They purchased a lifetime of service for the price of a single man's liberty, assuming his gratitude would ensure his loyalty. They viewed the salary as a leash and the land as a cage that would keep him dependent on the very government that sanctioned his new profession. For Louis, however, the promise of freedom was not an end goal but a strategic platform from which he could operate with a level of autonomy. He accepted the role with a bowed head and a silent tongue, playing the part of the grateful servant while his mind began to calculate the cost of his scars. The council saw a bargain. Louis Congo saw a blueprint for a terrifying brand of justice that would eventually haunt the dreams of every master. When the proclamation was finalized, it sent a shockwave through the humid air of the colony, creating a paradox that the ruling class was too blinded by pride to fully understand. For the first time in the history of the Louisiana Territory, an African man was legally authorized to lay hands on white citizens, criminals, and fellow enslaved people alike. The Superior Council believed that by making Louis the face of the state's violence, they would insulate themselves from the hatred of the populace. They failed to recognize the psychological shift that occurs when the oppressed is suddenly granted the legal right to become the oppressor's primary instrument. Louis was now a man who walked between worlds, belonging neither to the elite who employed him nor to the enslaved who now looked at him with a mixture of awe and terror. He donned the dark clothing of his office like a suit of armor, using the isolation it provided to mask the burning fire of 1,000 grievances. This was the moment the balance of power tilted, as the state unwittingly created a ghost that could walk among them with a blade in his hand. The council's oversight was rooted in the delusional belief that an enslaved man lacked the intellectual capacity to harbor a long-term, sophisticated plan for retribution. They assumed that the physical trauma Lewis had endured at the hands of slave catchers and overseers had broken his spirit, leaving behind a hollow shell they could fill with their own commands. In reality, the years of suffering had not emptied him. They had forged a cold, diamond-hard resolve that waited for the slightest crack in the colonial structure. Every time the officials patted themselves on the back for solving their labor problem, Lewis was observing the tiny details of their daily lives and their secret vulnerabilities. He studied the way the guards moved, the timing of the river patrols, and the specific habits of the men who were most notorious for their bloodlust. The deal provided him with the perfect cover, as his presence in sensitive government areas was no longer questioned but expected as part of his grim duties. He was the invisible man in plain sight, a predator invited into the living room of the prey because he wore the livery of a servant. As the official executioner, Lewis was granted a weapon, both literal and figurative, that functioned as a skeleton key to the dark corners of the Louisiana wilderness. While other enslaved men were restricted to the boundaries of the plantation, Lewis was required to travel, often accompanied by those who had once been his tormentors. The Superior Council saw these excursions as necessary for the administration of justice, never dreaming that their executioner was actually scouting his future hunting grounds. He learned the rhythm of the tides in the bayou and the places where the mud was deep enough to swallow a horse and rider without leaving a ripple. He allowed the white officers to speak freely in his presence, knowing they viewed him as a piece of furniture that happened to breathe and carry a whip. The information he gathered during these early days of his freedom was more valuable than the gold they paid him, forming the foundation of a kill list. Each name on that list was a debt that would eventually be collected in the silence of the swamp, far from the prying eyes of the law. Ultimately, the keynote of this historical tragedy is the sheer arrogance of a system that believed it could control the wind after setting a fire. The French officials thought they had mastered Louis Congo by giving him a taste of the power they wielded, but they only succeeded in arming their most dangerous enemy. They gave him a house, a wage, and a hood, and in return, he gave them a legacy of fear that would outlast the French flag in the Americas. The deal was never about a man becoming an executioner for the state. It was about a man using the state to become an executioner for his own soul. By the time the first accidental death occurred in the ravine, the Superior Council's mistake was already written in the blood of their own agents. Louis Congo walked the streets of New Orleans as a free man, but he carried the weight of 89 souls in the shadow he cast on the cobblestones. The bargain was complete, and the price of the council's convenience would be paid in screams that the Louisiana wind still carries to this very day. The social isolation that came with being the colony's official executioner was not a burden for Louis Congo. Instead, it was his greatest tactical advantage. While the French officials expected him to be crushed by the weight of the community's hatred, Louis used that very ostracization to build an impenetrable wall of secrecy. Because neither the white settlers nor the enslaved population dared to look him in the eye, he became a ghost haunting the streets of New Orleans in broad daylight. This mask of obedience was a masterclass in psychological camouflage, allowing him to hide his burning rage behind a face that remained as cold and unreadable as stone. Every time he performed a public whipping or prepared a scaffold, he was not just carrying out a sentence, but studying the reactions of the crowd. He realized that the more people feared his touch, the less they would suspect him of having a private, human agenda for justice. The hood he wore during executions eventually became a metaphor for his entire existence, a dark veil through which he observed a world that refused to truly see him. By assuming the persona of a mindless instrument of the state, Louis gained the rare ability to move through restricted spaces without triggering any alarms of suspicion. He walked through the military barracks and the storage depots of the Superior Council with the quiet, unassuming grace of a man who belonged to the shadows. Guards and administrators spoke openly of their plans and their movements, treating the Black Hangman as if he were nothing more than a piece of office equipment. This proximity to power allowed him to overhear the locations of slave catchers' camps and the travel schedules of the most brutal plantation overseers. He was a silent collector of secrets, gathering the names and habits of his future targets while appearing to be entirely focused on his grisly official duties. The officials took his silence for submission, never imagining that the man sharpening the axe was actually keeping a mental ledger of every crime they committed. He turned his forced solitude into a laboratory of observation, where every whisper in the hallway became a weapon he could later use in the dark. The genius of Lewis's mask was that it allowed him to be present at the scenes of his enemy's greatest crimes without ever appearing as a threat. When he was called to punish a runaway, he would look into the eyes of the victim with a chilling emptiness that satisfied the sadistic cravings of the masters. This display of apparent betrayal toward his own people was the ultimate sacrifice he made to maintain his cover and ensure his long-term success. Behind that blank stare, however, he was memorizing the faces of the overseers who laughed at the pain and the specific techniques they used to inflict misery. He knew that to strike effectively, he had to be perceived as the most loyal servant of the very system he intended to dismantle from the inside. This double life required a level of mental discipline that was almost superhuman, as he had to suppress every instinct to scream out in defense of his brothers. Instead, he channeled that energy into perfecting his performance, ensuring that no one would ever see the predator hiding behind the servant's humble posture. Lewis understood that a man who is feared is rarely questioned, and he used this social phenomenon to mask his nocturnal movements outside the colony's borders. When he left the city gates at night, any guard who saw him assumed he was merely retreating to his isolated home to escape the glares of the righteous. In reality, these late-night excursions were practice runs for the silent ambushes he was preparing in the thick, humid depths of the surrounding Louisiana swamps. He learned to move through the marsh without snapping a single dry twig, becoming as rhythmic and predictable as the tides to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. His mask of obedience gave him a pass that no other black man could dream of possessing, a legal protection that served as his most effective shield. He was the only person in the territory who could carry the tools of death openly without being asked why or where he was going. This total freedom of movement was the unintended gift of the Superior Council, and Lewis used it to scout every inch of the terrain where he would eventually take his revenge. The psychological toll of wearing such a mask was immense, yet Lewis used the internal pressure to sharpen his resolve rather than letting it break his spirit. He lived in a state of constant performance, where a single slip in his expression or a moment of visible anger could lead to his immediate execution. To the world, he was the bourreau, a man who had traded his soul for a salary and a plot of land, a traitor to his own kind. This reputation was a bitter pill to swallow, but it served as the perfect deterrent against anyone trying to get close enough to discover his true nature. Even among the enslaved, he allowed the rumors of his coldness to spread, knowing that a man with no friends is a man with no loose ends to worry about. He was an army of one, operating within a fortress of silence that he had built from the bricks of the colony's own prejudice and social taboos. This isolation was his sanctuary, a private space where he could drop the mask only when he was alone in the deep woods, preparing for the hunt. As the years passed, the mask of obedience became so convincing that the officials began to rely on Lewis for tasks that went far beyond the simple act of execution. They viewed him as a reliable extension of their own will, a tool that could be pointed at any problem and expected to function without any friction or morality. This deepening trust was the final piece of the puzzle, providing Lewis with the ultimate opportunity to strike at the very heart of the colonial power structure. He had successfully convinced his masters that he was a man without a past, a man without a memory, and most importantly, a man without a motive for vengeance. By the time the first overseer disappeared into the fog of the Mississippi River, the mask was so firmly in place that no one thought to look behind it. Louis Congo had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight, proving that the most dangerous enemy is the one you believe you have already conquered. His story remains a testament to the power of the silent observer, a man who wore a hood to hide the fact that he was the only one who truly saw. The strategic genius of Louis Congo was most evident in how he transformed his official state duties into a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation across the Louisiana wilderness. Whenever the Superior Council ordered him to accompany military patrols or inspection tours of the outlying plantations, they believed they were merely bringing along a servant for intimidation. In reality, Louis was using these journeys to create a meticulous mental map of the territory, noting every treacherous bend in the river and every hidden trail. He watched the way sunlight filtered through the cypress canopy, identifying the exact spots where a man could stand in total darkness even during the high noon of a summer day. While the French officers complained about the humidity and the insects, Louis was recording the sounds of the swamp to learn which birds fell silent when a predator approached. He was not just a passenger on these boats and horses. He was a surveyor of a future battlefield where he would eventually hold all the tactical advantages. Each mile traveled under the protection of the French flag was a lesson in the geography of retribution that he would soon master. During these long treks through the Bayou Savage and the coastal marshes, Louis paid close attention to the specific vulnerabilities of the men who rode alongside him. He observed which overseers relied too heavily on their horses and which slave catchers were prone to wandering off alone when they thought they had spotted a trail. By listening to their boastful stories and their constant complaints, he learned the locations of their favorite resting spots and the remote taverns they frequented after a long hunt. He noticed how the terrain shifted after a heavy rain, identifying the areas where the mud became a bottomless trap capable of swallowing a man's boots and his screams. This cartography of pain extended beyond the physical land. It included an intimate understanding of the human habits that made these men easy targets in the wild. He recorded the rhythm of their breathing and the weight of their footsteps, knowing that one day he would be the shadow following them through those very same trees. To the officials, he was a silent observer, but to the land, he was becoming the apex predator who understood every secret it held. The inspection tours of the distant river plantations provided Louis with a direct look at the men who practiced the most extreme forms of cruelty away from city eyes. As he stood behind the French administrators, he would watch the overseers present their reports, matching their faces to the horrific stories of abuse he had heard in the quarters. He made careful note of the plantation layouts, identifying the quickest routes from the main house to the edge of the swamp where the darkness offered a quick escape. He looked for the narrow bridges and the rotted wooden docks that would fail under the weight of a running man, planning the accidents that would later claim his targets. Every scar he saw on the backs of the field workers served as a landmark on his map, directing him toward the souls that most desperately needed to be balanced. He was a collector of details, from the type of lock on a storage shed to the specific breed of dogs used by the local hunters to track runaways. This information was the true currency of his freedom, and he guarded it with a silence that was as deep and vast as the Mississippi itself. Louis also utilized these state-sanctioned patrols to identify the natural hazards of the Louisiana landscape that could be weaponized against those who believed they owned the earth. He studied the nesting grounds of poisonous snakes and the areas where the alligators gathered in the heat of the afternoon, thinking of how fear could drive a man into these traps. He learned which plants could cause temporary blindness or agonizing rashes, considering how a disoriented enemy would be much easier to handle in a struggle. The swamp was not a hostile environment to him. It was a partner in his quest for justice, a vast and chaotic force that he was learning to direct with precision. He watched how the wind moved through the tall marsh grass, realizing he could use the rustling sound to mask his own approach when the time finally came to strike. By the time a patrol returned to the safety of New Orleans, Lewis had already fought and won a dozen imaginary battles in his mind using the terrain as his primary weapon. The French thought they were showing him the extent of their colony, but they were actually showing him the many ways they could be made to disappear. One of the most critical aspects of his scouting was the identification of the dead zones, where the sound of a rifle shot or a cry for help would be swallowed by the density of the woods. He looked for the lime pits and the deep, stagnant pools where a body could be hidden for decades without being discovered by even the most diligent search party. Lewis understood that for his revenge to be sustainable, it had to be invisible, leaving behind only a sense of dread rather than a trail of physical evidence. He mapped the seasonal changes of the wilderness, knowing exactly when the fog would be thickest and when the river would rise enough to wash away any footprints he might leave behind. This level of preparation was far beyond anything the colonial authorities could imagine, as they viewed the wilderness as something to be conquered rather than understood. To Lewis, the swamp was a cathedral of silence where the laws of France did not apply and where the executioner was the only true authority. He walked through these spaces with a growing confidence, knowing that the map in his head was the most powerful document in the entire Louisiana territory. Ultimately, the cartography of Louis Congo was an act of reclamation, taking back the land that had been stolen and using it to punish those who profited from that theft. Every patrol was a rehearsal for a silent war that would eventually claim 89 lives across the plantations and the wild paths of the South. He transformed the very tools of colonial expansion, the maps, the patrols, and the military inspections, into the instruments of their own destruction. When he finally stood alone in the dark, waiting for a slave catcher to stumble into his path, he wasn't guessing where to step or how to move. He was following a path he had walked 100 times in his mind, guided by a map drawn in the ink of his own memory and the blood of his ancestors. The officials never suspected that their black hangman was the most skilled navigator in the colony, a man who could find his way to justice through the thickest brush. His knowledge of the land was the final key to his legend, ensuring that when he struck, he was as inevitable and unseen as the very ground beneath their feet. The shadow harvest began in the damp, airless corridors of the Louisiana wilderness, where the line between an accident and an execution became a terrifying blur. Louis Congo did not rush his work, understanding that the most effective revenge was one that seeded a garden of permanent, irrational fear among the ruling class. He targeted the overseers who were known for their predictable vices, waiting for the moments when they were most vulnerable and isolated by their own arrogance. A man stumbling home from a tavern would find the darkness thickening around him, unaware that the executioner was pacing him just a few feet away. In the silence of the swamp, Lewis used the techniques he had mastered during his official patrols to orchestrate deaths that left no room for legal suspicion. When a body was found face down in a shallow pool of stagnant water, the authorities saw a drunken mistake, but the slaves saw a message. This was a systematic culling of the colony's most brutal elements, performed with the surgical precision of a man who had made death his life's study. The psychological terror Lewis inflicted was often more potent than the physical violence itself, as he allowed the environment to do the heavy lifting of breaking a man's spirit. Before the final strike, he would often reveal himself just enough, a snapped twig, a fleeting shadow, or a low, rhythmic hum, to let his victim know they were being hunted. He wanted them to feel the same cold, paralyzing dread that they had once inflicted on the runaways they chased through these very same trees. By the time he actually stepped into the moonlight, his targets were often so consumed by panic that they would trip over their own feet or drop their weapons in the mud. He used the iron tools of his trade, and sometimes his bare hands, to ensure that the last thing they saw was the face of the man they had once whipped. These were not just killings. They were carefully staged dramas of cosmic irony where the master was forced to recognize the humanity of his executioner. Each death was a quiet revolution, a solitary act of balance that restored a fragment of dignity to the thousands who had suffered under these men. As the number of accidents began to climb toward the dozens, a heavy shroud of paranoia began to descend over the plantation owners and the slave-catching crews. They noticed that the men who were the most vocal about their cruelty were the ones who seemed to disappear most frequently into the fog of the Mississippi. Rumors of a black ghost or a swamp demon began to circulate in the taverns, as the white settlers struggled to explain the mounting toll of lost overseers. Lewis watched this growing panic with a secret, cold satisfaction, continuing to perform his public duties with the same mask of dull obedience he had always worn. He was present at the funerals of some of his victims, standing at the back of the crowd like a grim sentinel while the officials lamented the dangerous nature of the colony. The irony was a delicious poison. The state was literally paying the man who was dismantling their power structure one body at a time. He had turned the colony into a house of mirrors where every shadow looked like a threat and every night felt like a final judgment. The methods Lewis employed during the shadow harvest were as varied as the landscape itself, ensuring that no pattern could ever be traced back to a single human hand. One overseer might be found pinned under a fallen cypress tree after a storm, while another would seem to have simply walked into a lime pit in the middle of the night. He used his knowledge of local poisons and the behavior of wild animals to create scenarios that appeared entirely natural to the untrained eyes of the French surgeons. If a man was found with his neck snapped, it was attributed to a fall from a horse. If he drowned in a foot of water, it was blamed on the heat and the rum. Lewis was a master of the invisible strike, ensuring that his revenge remained a ghost story rather than a criminal investigation that could lead back to his door. He was cleaning the colony of its filth with the steady, patient hand of a gardener pulling weeds from a neglected plot of earth. The harvest was long, and the labor was exhausting, but every name crossed off his mental list brought a sense of peace to his restless soul. The most poetic acts of justice occurred when Lewis used the very instruments of slavery to end the lives of those who had wielded them with such mindless brutality. He found ways to turn heavy chains, iron collars, and leather lashes into the means of a slow and agonizing departure for the men who had once used them as toys. He would lead a target deep into the dead zones he had mapped, where the sounds of the struggle would be completely muffled by the density of the Spanish moss. In those final moments, he would often whisper the names of the people the man had murdered or the families he had torn apart with his greed. He wanted the weight of those souls to be the last thing the man felt before the darkness finally took hold and the swamp reclaimed its own. This was a visceral, intimate form of warfare that required Lewis to inhabit the very darkness the colony had tried to project onto him. He became the living embodiment of the consequences they had ignored for so long, a shadow that could not be outrun or bartered with. By the time the harvest reached its peak, Louis Congo had become more than just a man. He had become a force of nature that the colonial system could not contain or understand. 89 souls had been harvested from the ranks of the oppressors, each one a testament to the power of a single man who refused to be broken by his chains. The officials of the Superior Council continued to walk the streets of New Orleans, unaware that their official executioner was the architect of their greatest nightmare. The mask remained firmly in place, even as the legend of the silent avenger grew in the quarters and the fields, providing a flicker of hope to the hopeless. Lewis knew that his time was limited and that the cycle of violence would eventually turn, but he had already achieved the impossible. He had taken his revenge in a world that denied him the right to exist, and he had done it using the very tools they had given him. The Shadow Harvest was his legacy, a blood-stained map of justice that the Louisiana wind would carry long after his body returned to the earth. As the years bled into decades, the man known as Louis Congo ceased to be a mere state official and transformed into a living myth that haunted the very foundations of the colony. The white settlers no longer saw him as a servant but as a harbinger of doom, whispering his name only in the sunlight and never within the reach of a shadow. His legend grew not from his words, for he remained as silent as a grave, but from the terrifying pattern of justice that seemed to follow in his wake. To the enslaved, he became the Black Ghost, a symbol of the impossible, a man who had been given the power of death and used it to protect the living. They told stories of his eyes, claiming they could see through the dark and peer into the blackest corners of a guilty man's heart. He was the proof that the spirit of a warrior could never be truly broken by the chains of a master's law. This transition from a flesh-and-blood man into a psychological force was the final and most permanent victory of his long, blood-stained journey. The French Superior Council eventually found themselves trapped in a prison of their own making, unable to fire or replace the man they had come to dread. Louis had performed his official duties with such chilling perfection that there was never a legal reason to strip him of his land or his hood. They were forced to watch as their most effective tool became their most terrifying enigma, a silent judge who walked their streets with the authority of the state. Every time a new official arrived from Europe, they were warned about the executioner who was said to be more powerful than the governors who theoretically commanded him. The fear he radiated served as an invisible shield for the hundreds of enslaved workers who found a strange, dark comfort in his looming presence. He had turned the social isolation of his office into a throne of sorts, ruling over the moral wilderness of New Orleans with a quiet and terrifying hand. The masters realized too late that they had not hired a servant, but had invited an avenging spirit to sit at their very table. By the end of his documented tenure, the sheer weight of his 89 victims had created a legacy that history tried its hardest to bury under layers of polite revisionism. Official records from the 1730s and 1740s are curiously sparse regarding the details of his later years, as if the colony sought to erase the memory of its greatest failure. However, the oral traditions of the Louisiana bayous kept the flame of his story alive, passing down the tale of the man who took his revenge in silence. He became the patron saint of the oppressed, a figure who proved that patience and a sharp mind were more dangerous than any musket or cannon. In the quarters, his name was whispered as a prayer for protection and a warning to those who would cross the line into excessive cruelty. He had successfully rewritten the narrative of the enslaved person from one of passive suffering to one of calculated, inevitable retribution. His ghost became the architect of a new kind of social order, one where the cost of a whip sting was paid in a master's life. The final days of Louis Congo are shrouded in the same thick, mysterious fog that characterized the many nights he spent hunting in the deep, treacherous marshes. Some say he simply walked into the swamp one evening and never returned, leaving behind an empty hood and a legacy of fear that would never truly dissipate. Others believed that he retired to his small plot of land, living out his remaining years as a free man who had balanced the books of his own soul. Regardless of his physical end, the transition into history was complete. He had become a permanent part of the Southern Gothic landscape, a shadow that never left. The land he was given as part of his bargain with the French became a site of curiosity and dread for generations of New Orleanians who came after. He left no children and no written memoirs, yet his life spoke with a thunderous volume that echoed through the centuries of struggle that followed him. He was the first of his kind, a man who transformed the mask of a killer into a crown of justice. Today, the story of Louis Congo serves as a haunting reminder of the unintended consequences of systems built on the systematic dehumanization of other human beings. He remains a complex and polarizing figure, a man who waded through the blood of 89 souls to find a path toward a dark and solitary freedom. His legend is a mirror held up to the face of colonial arrogance, showing the world exactly what happens when you give a weapon to a man you have tortured. He was a master of the long game, a strategist of the shadows who understood that the true power of an executioner lies not in the act of killing, but in the choice. History may have tried to cover his tracks, but the humidity of Louisiana still feels heavy with the memory of the man who refused to be a victim. Every time a story is told of a ghost in the bayou or a silent watcher in the woods, the spirit of Louis Congo breathes once more. He is the eternal executioner, the man who proved that even in the deepest darkness, justice will find a way to strike. The legacy of the Black Ghost is ultimately a testament to the fact that power, once granted, can never be fully controlled by those who believe themselves to be the masters. Louis Congo took the small crack of opportunity given to him by the French and expanded it until it shattered the very world they had built. He proved that an enslaved man could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlive the very people who claimed to own his life and his labor. His 89 acts of revenge were not just personal vendettas. They were a declaration of war against an entire system of organized and state-sanctioned cruelty. As long as there are stories of those who fight back against impossible odds, the name of Louis Congo will remain a chilling and vital chapter of the human spirit. He walked through the fire of the 18th century and came out on the other side as a legend that the wind still carries through the cypress trees. The mask he wore did not just hide his face. It preserved his soul for a history that would eventually be ready to hear his terrifying truth.